welcome to our commercial real estate series, Behind the Building, giving the audience a behind the scenes look at different aspects of commercial real estate, featuring industry professionals and leaders who we work with every day to make it all happen. With me today is Jessica Elliott, commercial real estate attorney from Manning Fulton, who advises clients across real estate law and commercial finance. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, and interestingly enough, Jessica and I are working through negotiating a purchase agreement for one of my clients. But today we're going to be looking at lease agreements on commercial properties and how to make sure all the fine print saves lots of headaches between tenants and landlords in the future. So, let's get started with some of the foundational aspects of lease language. So, Jessica, what are some of the common areas of misunderstanding between landlords and tenants that you see leading to dispute down the road?
So typically the biggest misunderstanding I see is the delivery conditions. A lot of times tenants will make the incorrect assumption that a landlord is going to do some sort of work to the premises, and most leases are as is delivery, unless the landlord is doing improvements. And a lot of times this can lead to some confusion for the tenants. The second biggest area is typically the ongoing maintenance requirements. A lot of leases in our industry are triple net leases, which means that the tenant does most of the work inside the premises at their sole cost, which could be everything up to replacing the HVAC system, which is a big ticket item that tenants aren't necessarily thinking about. So those are kind of the two biggest areas where I see that there's misunderstanding and confusion in the leasing aspect.
So, as it relates to the maintenance and repairs, since that is often a place where confusion and contention, if you will, arises, how can you draft lease provisions that better define who's responsible between the landlord and the tenant so that there's not the finger pointing down the road?
The language just needs to be as clear as possible. And again, and I'm going to say this throughout our discussion, and both parties need to actually read the lease and understand it. Um, a lot of times, like I said, in triple net leases, most of that responsibility will fall on the tenant. So that lease needs to clearly define exactly what aspects, where it gets a little in the gray areas when we start talking about what are capital repairs and building replacements. Typically, landlords will be responsible for the roof and the structural elements and utilities outside the premises. But I've had a couple of instances lately where the plumbing system, which most people would consider a capital repair, but depending on the lease language, that could actually fall upon the tenant to do those repairs, depending on if it serves any other premises, where it's located, and things of that nature. And again, that could be a $40,000 to $60,000 repair that a tenant was not expecting.
Right. They don't have that in their budget.
Exactly.
Yeah. You've talked a little bit about the operating expenses. What about common area maintenance charges that relate to the triple net lease agreements? How do you recommend to make it very clear as to how it's going to be reconciled and just to make sure that all those accounting expenses are transparent and fair for both parties?
Right. And again, everybody needs to read their lease. And what we see in the industry, some landlords will pass through as much as they can, even capital expenses, to the point that as long as it's amortized over the useful life, that it can be passed through. So it's important that the parties understand kind of what is being passed through. And a good place to really where I think you start presenting it, if I'm representing a landlord, where it's presented is even in the LOI, because a lot of times the LOI will specify exactly, the pass-through cost.
One of the biggest issues that you talked about at the beginning was around the improvements and the upfits. The tenants, they need specific to their needs. So, what do you normally see issues around that where the language hasn't been drafted well enough or clearly enough at move in, and what happens at move out, even? Because I've seen that before where we didn't
Right.
really talk about what happens when they move out. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
So a lot of times the landlords will either give a tenant improvement allowance or they will actually do the upfit for the tenant. And so when there is a tenant improvement allowance, typically the landlord is delivering as is. So it's really important for the tenant to go in and inspect the premises to make sure that they understand kind of what they need to do those improvements and just to make sure that they're budgeting correctly. Because again, if it's as is, if they get in the walls and the electrical had not been upgraded and when they're pulling permits, they're going to have to do certain upgrades. And again, all that needs to be clearly defined in the lease of what is being delivered, who is responsible for what. Because again, if it's with the initial delivery and it's being delivered as is, then it's all going to fall on the tenant and it's going to be a tenant's cost.
Mhm. Yeah, so the devil is in the
The
details,
devil is
just
in the
no
details.
stone left unturned as it relates to all the things that you might need to make it operational
Right.
for your business, and just having good contractors who know what they're doing to be able to go in there and understand the scope of work and all those things. Moving into renewals and terminations, the lease terms ended. Tenants and landlords have some things to discuss a lot of times at the end. Does the tenant want to stay? Does the landlord want the tenant to stay? What's next? So, what do you advise for, just clear language so that there's no confusion at that point in the lease agreement?
Right. And if I'm representing a tenant, I'd say try to get a renewal option, because without a renewal option, then the landlord has no obligation to renew the lease. And at the end of the term, you will have to leave. So if you plan to be there long term, which I'm assuming most tenants don't want to move every 5 years because it's expensive, then they really need to have a renewal option in there. And the language will be clear, whether or not you have a renewal option. And then what are the terms of that renewal option? Do you want to go ahead and try to lock into a rental rate, or do you want it to try to be a fair market rate at the time? In the last 5 years, rental rates have increased a lot, especially for industrial. So people who had built-in rates really got a benefit of our economy. But the landlords, on the other hand, only want the fair market.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's what I'm seeing as well. So the provisions that are way down the line in a lease agreement, the default and remedies, you don't want to talk about it, but you do need to make sure that they are in there for everyone's protection.
Right.
So how do you balance the landlord's protection in that and then still give the tenants a fair shake and opportunity to cure those defaults?
So generally, I mean, again, with the lease, I think it's going to be a little more landlord friendly in any time of default provision, default and remedies. If I'm representing a tenant, I try to make sure that we do get some notice and cure periods. A lot of standard leases, when they get sent out, there are no cure periods for rental for the payment of rent. So a landlord could automatically just put you in default and start exercising remedies. And I've actually had that happen because they wanted a tenant out and they just immediately, because they were late by 2 days, that they were trying to get them out of the premises. So just having that notice and cure period, making sure that the landlord does have to provide some sort of notice to the tenant. As far as the remedies are concerned, if I'm, again, most standard leases have that the landlord can exercise self-help and lock the doors as long as it's peaceful and there's certain language. And if I'm representing a tenant, or if I'm representing a landlord and a tenant requested, they would typically request to go through summary ejectment proceedings. So they actually have to go through a court proceeding other than just padlocking somebody's door.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned the standard forms, and we use the North Carolina Standard Bar form quite often with lease agreements, and um, especially with the simple ones. And you said that it's generally more landlord friendly, um, and it doesn't provide all the language that one might hope for, I think, with some more complicated cases. So,
Right.
when do you advise to gain your expertise for lease drafting and things that are more complicated?
I think that's going to always depend on what the client wants and how what the client's looking for. The bar form lease is not a bad starting point, and for simple transactions, it's not bad. Even we have clients who use it, and then we will draft an addendum to it for specific deal points that we want modified within the lease form. Again, and going back to what I started with, the both sides really need to read it and understand. It is fair, and it's pretty middle of the road, if not a little bit landlord friendly, as most are. But both parties really need to understand what is in that lease, because there's a lot of times that we'll have clients call, we didn't prepare the lease, and they're saying, well, they didn't do this, they didn't do this. It's like, well, what does the lease say? And we have to pull the lease and actually read it, and they're like, well, I didn't think that's what it said.
When we were at a panel discussion, you were providing a lot of good advice at a luncheon, and you had mentioned about providing a lease abstract as a summary to try to clarify and help direct that lease down the
Right.
road so that it was something easy for the tenant and the landlord to be able to refer to when there were questions at different intervals of the lease stage. So I found that to be valuable advice, and we've been utilizing that
Oh,
as
good.
just making a summary, simple summary, so that, I mean, of course, the lease agreement stands
Mhm.
and is the Bible, so to speak, for that
Right.
agreement, but it is a helpful document. And it sounds like you probably provide the lease abstracts quite often for your clients.
We do when they request, and it's also a good, area where you cite which section it's in. So you can read the little kind of 1-2 sentence blurb, but then actually, then you have the reference point. You can go and you can read it. And again, like I said before, reading the lease is really important. And with anytime I have a client who has an issue, they'll call and they'll say, this is, here's what's going on and what can we do? And I'll say, well, let me read the lease and I'll get back to you, because every single lease is different.
Mm-hmm. So as we round out this interview, what is the single most important piece of advice that you would give, other than what you've already said? Reading the
Read the lease.
lease, make sure that every detail that you can um, think of is included in that lease. Any other pieces of wisdom?
So for a landlord client, I think it's important that before they enter into the LOI, enter into the lease, if they're new to the commercial real estate world, figuring out how you want your property to operate. Is it going to be a triple net lease? And if it is a triple net lease, what are you going to what costs are you going to pass through? Have you budgeted appropriately for those CAM costs? And just really understanding your product that you're going to lease to a tenant.
Hmm. Yeah, that's tremendous. I mean, knowing your building much better than what a prospective tenant would know,
Right.
how they would know it, so that you can avoid the misunderstandings in the future. And that's what we as brokers, at least I pride myself in trying to understand that building inside and out, so that they have an airtight lease agreement, and that the agreement that they've entered into really works for them as the building functions. So I really appreciate you, Jessica, for being on this episode of Behind the Building. And I encourage viewers to reach out to me, as I want to be your resource for all things commercial real estate. And I can help connect you with Jessica from Manning Fulton and other professionals that you need to ensure you're protecting your commercial real estate property and your returns. Be sure to keep an eye out for future Behind the Building interviews with other awesome industry professionals like Jessica.